What does it take to wake up a man who is sleepwalking through his own life? For Cassian Royce, a billionaire who commanded empires from a tower of glass and steel, the answer wasn't more money, or more power, or more success. He had all of that. And in the silent, sterile world he had built for himself, he felt absolutely nothing. His heart was a locked room in a silent fortress, and he was both the prisoner and the guard. But what happens when a key to that room, a key you never even knew existed, finds its way into your hands by pure, dumb, beautiful chance? What happens when the one thing that can shatter the walls of your fortress isn't a hostile takeover or a market crash, but something small, something intimate, something you can't possibly control? This is the story of how a simple, mundane mistake at an airport baggage claim led a man who felt nothing to a scent that felt like everything. A warm, intoxicating scent of jasmine and honey, belonging to a woman he had never met, whose entire life was the polar opposite of his own. It's a story about a desperate search, not just for a stranger, but for a feeling. And it asks a simple, powerful question. Can a single drop of perfume, found by accident, be strong enough to bring two worlds and two souls crashing together? Stay with us and find out. Some worlds are built of glass and steel. They are constructed from the cold, hard lines of profit margins and the abstract, upward curve of projected earnings. These are worlds that exist in the silent, climate-controlled hum of penthouse offices, where deals worth more than the entire economy of a small nation are sealed with a quiet nod and the whisper of an expensive fountain pen on heavy bond paper. In this kind of world, emotion is seen as a liability. It is a bug in the code, a ghost in the machine, a fundamental flaw to be methodically engineered out of the system for maximum efficiency. This was the world, the very fortress, of Cassian Royce. At the age of 32, he stood at the apex of this world, the CEO of a global luxury brand, a veritable titan of industry. He had inherited a formidable empire from his father, and with a ruthless and brilliant focus, had multiplied its value tenfold. His life was a fortress of his own meticulous design, its walls built from the granite of discipline, the steel of logic, and the chilling mortar of absolute control. He had made a conscious decision years ago to feel nothing, because feeling was inefficient. Feeling was a distraction. His cologne, a scent custom blended in a small Parisian perfumery, was expensive and so subtle it was almost an absence of scent, a fragrance designed to command respect, not to be remembered. His heart, if you were to ask him, was simply a locked room, and he had long since melted down the key. But the universe is a place of balance. And so, across the sprawling, breathing city, in a world spun not from steel but from sunlight, not from profit but from petals, another life was being lived. It was a life measured not in the frantic ticking of the stock market, but in the slow, deliberate unfurling of a new bloom. A life whose value was calculated in the genuine laughter of a satisfied customer, in the quiet, comforting hum of a neighborhood waking up to the smell of damp earth and fresh coffee. This was the world of Nia Reid. Nia's world was everything Cassian's was not. It was authentic. It was emotional. And it was, if you looked closely, just a little bit wounded. After a devastating breakup with a man who saw her deep-seated passion as a frivolous hobby and her heart as a project to be managed and improved, she had taken a bold, terrifying leap. She had poured every last cent of her savings and every single ounce of her soul into a tiny storefront she christened the Honest Petal. Her shop was her defiance. It was her declaration of independence. Her world, in stark contrast to Cassian's subtle cologne, was represented by a scent she had blended herself on her small kitchen table, a simple, intoxicating fusion of jasmine and honey. It was natural, it was warm, and it was devastatingly real. It was, in its essence, everything she was. These two worlds, one of sterile, untouchable power and one of vibrant, vulnerable passion, were never meant to collide. They operated in different orbits, on entirely different planes of existence, governed by opposing laws of emotional physics. But sometimes, all it takes is a single moment of beautiful human chaos, a simple, tired error at a bustling, indifferent airport, to send two distant galaxies spinning wildly, inexorably into one another. And it all started, as the most life-altering stories so often do, with a suitcase. The trip to Geneva had been, by all objective measures, a resounding success. A new, prestigious line of Swiss watches had been acquired, another venerable brand absorbed into the ever-expanding Royce portfolio. For Cassian, it was simply Tuesday. It was business as usual. As he stepped into the cavernous, echoing silence of his penthouse apartment, he loosened the knot of his silk tie, the only outward sign of his bone-deep travel fatigue. His routine, upon returning home, was as precise and unvarying as a mathematical proof. He would unpack. He would take a precisely 12-minute shower. He would then spend 2 hours reviewing the Asian market reports that had come in while he was in the air, and then he would sleep for exactly 6 hours. There was a strange, sterile comfort to be found in the cold, predictable calculus of his life. The sleek, black suitcase, identical to 1,000 others, glided across the polished marble floor. He placed it on a large leather ottoman in the center of his cavernous living room, a room so devoid of personal touches it looked more like a high-end furniture showroom than a home. The silence of the apartment was broken by the sharp, satisfying click of 2 suitcase latches springing open. He lifted the lid. And then he froze. It was a sensation so alien to him that for a moment his brain couldn't process it. His mind, that finely tuned machine for logistics, acquisitions, and problem-solving, simply stopped. This wasn't his suitcase. Inside, where there should have been a row of neatly folded, monochromatic designer shirts and stark white boxers, was a riot of color and texture. It was chaos. It was life. A soft, knitted cardigan in a shade of brilliant, unapologetic yellow lay on top. Beneath it, a pair of worn, comfortable-looking jeans, the knees slightly faded. There was a small, slightly battered paperback novel, its cover creased, a single page dog-eared to mark the reader's place. His first instinct was annoyance. This was a disruption. An inefficiency. His mind immediately began calculating the steps needed to rectify the error. Call airport security. Lodge a complaint with the baggage claim service. Better yet, simply call his ruthlessly efficient assistant, Amelia, and have her deal with it. It was a simple, irritating logistical snag in the seamless fabric of his life. He started to close the lid, to shut away this unwelcome intrusion of another person's messy existence. But then, something stopped him. A flash of deep crimson, peeking out from under the yellow cardigan. It was a scarf, made of a soft, worn pashmina, and it seemed to almost glow with an inner warmth against the cold, gray backdrop of his minimalist apartment. He hadn't seen a color that loud, that vibrant, that alive, in his own home in years. Against his will, a will he usually commanded with absolute authority, his hand reached out. He expected to touch it, but it was more like the fabric touched him back. It was softer than he could have possibly imagined. As he lifted it, he saw something else tucked beneath it, something that felt far more personal, far more private. It was a journal. A worn, brown leather journal, the cover softened and smoothed with age and use. There was no name etched on it, just a small, embossed flower in the corner, a detail so subtle he almost missed it. He knew, on a distant intellectual level, that opening it was a profound invasion of privacy. A violation of some unspoken social contract. But he couldn't stop himself. It was as if another, more curious entity had taken control of his hands. He opened it. The pages were filled with a beautiful, flowing, almost lyrical handwriting. There were intricate, detailed sketches of flowers he couldn't name, accompanied by notes on their origins and meanings. There were pressed petals, delicate and translucent, tucked carefully between the pages like treasured secrets. This wasn't just a collection of items in a suitcase anymore. It was the tangible evidence of a person. A person so fundamentally, so radically different from him that it felt like discovering a new and fascinating species. The journal was a chronicle of a life lived with open eyes and, more shockingly, an open heart. It was filled with quiet observations about the changing light of the seasons, about the way strangers smiled at each other on the subway, about the simple, profound joy of a perfect cup of tea. He should have been angry. The Cassian Royce he knew, the man he had painstakingly constructed over the last decade, would have been disgusted by the mess, by the unbridled sentimentality of it all. But as he stood there, turning the fragile pages, something deep in his chest, a tight, cold knot he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was even there, felt strange. It felt like it was beginning to loosen. And then he saw it. Rolled into a corner of the suitcase, almost hidden, was a small, unassuming glass bottle. It had a simple, handwritten label, the same elegant script as the journal. It read, "Jasmine and honey." The liquid inside was a warm, golden amber. The cap must have been slightly loose from the journey, because as he picked it up, a single tiny, almost invisible drop escaped, landing on the back of his hand. And the scent hit him. It was not a fragrance. The chemically engineered, focus-grouped products he sold for thousands of dollars a bottle were fragrances. This was something else entirely. It was a scent that didn't just enter the nose. It bypassed all logic and reason and seeped directly into the bloodstream, into the memory, into the very architecture of the soul. It was the smell of a sun-drenched garden right after a cleansing summer rain. It was the raw, unfiltered sweetness of honey, warmed by the sun, and the intoxicating, heady bloom of night-blooming jasmine. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a scent that didn't ask for permission. It simply stormed the fortress walls of his logic and his discipline, and it laid siege to a part of him he thought had died long ago. Or perhaps, had never been given the chance to be alive at all. In an instant, his mind was flooded with a rapid-fire, dreamlike montage of images he had never seen, but felt with an intense, gut-wrenching familiarity. A wide, open field of wildflowers under a brilliant blue sky. The impossible softness of a child's hand holding his. A woman, her face just out of focus, throwing her head back in a peal of genuine, uninhibited laughter. The feeling of warm sunshine on his skin, a sensation he hadn't truly registered in years. These were the phantom limbs of a life he had never lived, the echoes of feelings he had never allowed himself to feel. It was the scent of warmth, the scent of genuine, uncurated happiness. It was the scent of home, a concept so foreign to him it might as well have been a word from another language. He stood there, frozen, in the echoing silence of his empty penthouse, a multi-billionaire CEO holding a stranger's life in his hands, completely and utterly undone by a single drop of perfume. The logistical problem of the switched bags was forgotten. The flicker of irritation was long gone. In its place was a new, burning, all-consuming question that roared to life in the vacuum of his soul. Who did this scent belong to? What was it about this stranger's perfume that could make a man who felt nothing suddenly feel everything? Cassian Royce didn't have the answer. But in that moment, he knew, with a certainty that frightened and thrilled him, that he would move heaven and earth to find out. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, in an apartment that was the polar opposite of Cassian's, small, cozy, and filled to the brim with plants and books, Nia Reid was having a full-blown, five-alarm crisis. You have to understand, for someone like Nia, the world that Cassian Royce inhabited was the stuff of fiction, of glossy magazines she'd flip through while waiting in line at the grocery store. His suitcase, now sitting open on her bed, was like an artifact from another planet. She pulled out a stark white shirt and held it up. The fabric was impossibly smooth, the stitching perfect. She glanced at the label and her stomach did a nervous flip. The shirt alone probably cost more than her monthly rent. Everything in the suitcase was a shade of black, gray, or clinical white. Everything was folded with a terrifying, geometric precision. It was the most soulless, intimidating collection of clothing she had ever seen in her life. Panic, cold and sharp, was rising in her chest like a tide. She had already called the airline's beleaguered baggage service a dozen times, leaving a series of increasingly frantic and rambling messages. The idea of some powerful, faceless, and certainly furious CEO discovering her worn-out jeans, her tattered paperback, and worst of all, her secret, heartfelt journal, was an exercise in pure mortification. It felt like a recurring nightmare she used to have, the one where she was suddenly naked in a crowded, silent room. Just then, her phone buzzed on the nightstand, an angry, jarring sound in her quiet apartment. She jumped. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Her heart sank into her shoes. This was it. She took a shaky breath and answered, trying to sound composed and failing miserably. Her voice was a squeak. "Hello." A voice on the other end responded, and it stopped her cold. It was deep, calm, and impossibly smooth, like dark chocolate or aged whiskey. "Am I speaking with Nia Reid?" She managed to confirm it was her mind racing at 1,000 miles an hour. He must be furious. He was probably going to sue her for emotional distress caused by her chaotic belongings. He probably had a whole team of lawyers who specialized in suing normal people over suitcase mix-ups. "This is Cassian Royce," the voice said, and the name hit her like a physical object. She'd seen it in the financial news. "I believe you have my luggage. And I have yours." Nia's apology tumbled out of her mouth, a frantic, incoherent cascade of words. She was so sorry, the airport had been a madhouse, she was so exhausted from her trip, she'd bring it anywhere he wanted, immediately, she could be there in 30 minutes. She braced herself for the inevitable response. A cold, dismissive sigh, the clipped anger of a man whose time was infinitely more valuable than hers. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a pause. A silence that stretched just a little too long, a silence that felt heavy with something she couldn't quite decipher. "It's no trouble," Cassian said finally, and his voice was different now. Quieter. Less like a CEO and more like a person. "However, I'd prefer to handle the exchange in person. Would you be available to meet for coffee tomorrow morning?" Nia was stunned into a new kind of silence. Coffee? She had been expecting a summons, a curt instruction to leave the bag with his doorman, a lecture from an angry assistant. She was not expecting a personal invitation from the man himself. Why on earth would a powerful man like Cassian Royce want to meet in person? Couldn't he just send someone? A new and unfamiliar anxiety, one laced with a bewildering and potent thread of curiosity, began to bloom in her chest. Across the city, standing by his floor-to-ceiling window, Cassian stroked the soft fabric of her crimson scarf with his thumb. He wasn't entirely sure himself why he had just said that. His schedule was a fortress, planned and guarded down to the minute for weeks in advance. But for the first time in a decade, he found himself possessed by an overwhelming urge to disrupt it, to blow a hole in the side of his own carefully constructed fortress. He told himself it was about ensuring the safe return of the sensitive corporate documents in his briefcase, which was tucked inside the suitcase. But he knew, with a clarity that was both unsettling and exhilarating, that it was a lie. He wanted to see the woman who wore a crimson scarf and sketched flowers in a worn leather journal. He wanted to meet the woman who smelled of jasmine and honey. He had to know if the person herself was as intoxicating as her scent. And so, he did something he never, ever did. He called his assistant. He told her to reschedule everything before noon. He was clearing his morning. For a complete stranger. A new, unfamiliar feeling was taking root in the long barren soil of his soul. Anticipation. The coffee shop was his choice, of course. It was a chic, brutally minimalist space in the wealthiest part of town, a place so sleek and monochromatic it made Nia's teeth ache. She felt like a wildflower that had accidentally sprouted through a tiny crack in a vast marble floor, doomed to be plucked at any moment. She sat at a small, cold table, nervously twisting a paper napkin in her hands until it disintegrated into shreds. She had spent a full hour that morning agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on a simple dress that felt like a weak and unconvincing imitation of the effortless, expensive confidence that seemed to be the required uniform here. Every minute that ticked by on the large, silent clock on the wall amplified her anxiety. She had built up a whole narrative in her head. Cassian Royce would be handsome, naturally, but in a severe, intimidating way. He would be cold. Dismissive. He would make the exchange with curt, clipped efficiency, look down his long, aristocratic nose at her, and then disappear back into his world of glass towers, leaving her feeling small and foolish and utterly out of her depth. And then, the bell above the door chimed softly, and he walked in. And the air, all of it, seemed to leave Nia's lungs in a single silent rush. He was exactly as she had pictured, and yet, completely, breathtakingly different. In photographs, he looked powerful. In person, his presence was an overwhelming force of gravity. He wore a dark gray suit that fit him so perfectly it seemed to have been constructed around him. He moved with an easy, predatory grace that made the entire, bustling room seem to tilt in his direction. He scanned the space for less than a second before his eyes found hers, and locked on. As he approached her table, she saw something she didn't expect, something the photographs had never captured. His eyes, a cool, piercing gray like a stormy sea, weren't cold at all. They were intense. They were focused. And they were focused entirely, and unervingly, on her. "Nia," he said, and his voice was even deeper, richer than it had been on the phone. He said her name not as a question, but as a statement of fact. She managed to stand, her hand feeling clammy and small as she shook his. His grip was firm, warm, and it lingered for a fraction of a second too long. "Mr. Royce, I am so sorry about the mix-up." Again. A smile touched his lips. It was a small thing, a subtle upward curve at the corners of his mouth, but it completely transformed his face, softening the hard, chiseled edges and making him look years younger. "Please," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Call me Cassian. And it's I who should apologize. My travel arrangements are usually seamless. This was an unforeseen variable. He gestured for her to sit, sliding into the chair opposite her with a disconcerting fluidity. I hope you weren't too inconvenienced. Nia should have been intimidated. She should have been flustered and angry. But something in his expression, in the quiet, unnerving curiosity in his eyes, stopped her. There was no judgment there, no condescension. The enormous tension she had been holding in her shoulders for the past 24 hours began to release, slowly, cautiously, replaced by a bewildering sense of calm. The conversation that followed was the biggest surprise of all. He wasn't dismissive. He wasn't arrogant. He was engaged. He asked her questions, and they weren't the polite, superficial questions of a stranger making awkward small talk. They were real questions. He asked about the dog-eared paperback in her suitcase, what she thought of the ending. He asked about a particular sketch of a flower in her journal, the one she'd labeled Queen Anne's lace. Nia found herself flushing, a wave of heat rising in her cheeks, embarrassed that this powerful, sophisticated man had seen such intimate, personal pieces of her life. "You're an artist," he stated, once again not as a question, but as a conclusion he had reached. "Oh no, not really," she stammered, looking down at her hands. I own a small flower shop. I like to draw what I sell." And right there, in that moment, with that simple, humble admission, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. The air between them crackled with a new, unexpected energy. Cassian leaned forward, his elbows on the table. The manufactured scent of roasted coffee beans, the subtle, expensive trace of his own cologne, it all faded into the background. All he could smell, faintly, as if it were a memory, was the ghost of jasmine and honey that seemed to cling to her like an aura. "A flower shop," he repeated the words slowly, as if they were from a foreign language he was trying to understand. "I saw your business plan sketches, in the back of your journal." The honest petal. "Tell me about it." And so, she did. She found herself speaking about her little shop with a passion that she rarely showed to strangers, a passion that lit up her entire face and made her forget to be nervous. She talked about her core philosophy, the idea of selling honest flowers. She explained that she didn't like the perfectly cultivated, chemically preserved, genetically identical blooms that were flown in from across the world, engineered to be flawless. She preferred local, seasonal, sometimes beautifully imperfect flowers that had a story. Flowers that lived and wilted and faded and were just as beautiful in their decay as they were in their peak. Flowers that were real. She fully expected him to be bored, to glaze over. A man who dealt in the cold, hard currency of billions would surely find her small-scale, sentimental passion quaint, even pathetic. But he wasn't bored. He was listening with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. He watched her speak as if she were the most fascinating, complex puzzle he had ever encountered. For Cassian, it was nothing short of a revelation. His entire world, his entire business empire, was built on the concept of perfection. About manufacturing an image of flawless, unattainable, and therefore desirable, luxury. Her world was about embracing imperfection, about finding the profound beauty in the authentic, the flawed, the real. She wasn't just talking about flowers, she was talking about an entire philosophy of life, one so profoundly alien to his own that it felt like a splash of cold, clean, life-giving water to the face. The initial tension of their awkward meeting had completely dissolved, released by his unexpected invitation and his even more unexpected interest. It was replaced by something far more potent, far more dangerous, a spark of genuine, undeniable connection. For the first time, perhaps in his entire adult life, the cold, untouchable CEO was showing a significant crack in his armor. And for Nia, the terrifying titan of industry she had dreaded meeting was starting to look disturbingly, wonderfully human. The coffee eventually ended. The suitcases were swapped in the cavernous trunk of his sleek, silent, black car. And as they stood on the busy sidewalk, an awkward silence, thick with unspoken things, fell between them. This should be the end. A strange, memorable anecdote they would one day tell their friends. But neither of them moved. Neither of them wanted to leave. "I'd like to see it," Cassian said suddenly, his voice cutting through the noise of the city traffic. Nia was confused, pulled from her thoughts. "See what?" "Your shop," he said, his intense gray eyes fixed on hers. "The honest petal. I'd like to see these honest flowers. The invitation hung in the air between them, shimmering with unspoken possibility. It was so much more than a request to see a shop. It was a request to step over a threshold, to enter her world. And Nia, against all logic, against every self-preservational instinct that was screaming at her to run from a man whose world was vast and powerful enough to swallow hers whole without even noticing, heard herself say one simple, world-changing word. Okay. Stepping through the door of the Honest Petal, with its cheerfully jingling bell, was like stepping from a black-and-white film into a world of vibrant technicolor. The air inside was warm and humid, alive with 1,000 different, competing fragrances that overwhelmed the senses in the most wonderful way. It was the scent of damp earth, of fresh-cut stems, of blooming petals. The shop was messy, gloriously chaotic, and to Cassian, it was the most beautiful place he had ever been. It was the polar opposite of his silent, sterile penthouse. It was alive. And then there was Nia. In the minimalist coffee shop, she had been guarded, nervous, a visitor in his territory. Here, in her world, she was radiant. She was like the sun, and everything in this little cluttered shop was a planet in her orbit. He watched, mesmerized, as she moved with a natural, unconscious grace, her hands confidently trimming stems, her face relaxed and lit with a genuine, unforced happiness. She was wearing a simple linen apron smudged with dirt, and she had never looked more beautiful. Cassian, in his perfect $1,000 suit, had never felt more out of place. He watched as she explained each flower to him, not by its Latin name or its market price, but by its personality. She introduced him to the shy, retiring violets, the dramatic, attention-seeking peonies, the sturdy, dependable lavender that always smelled of home. He found himself utterly captivated. His gaze fell upon a bucket of what he, in his profound ignorance, would have dismissed as common weeds. They were delicate, white, and looked utterly untamed. "What are those?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Nia smiled, a genuine, luminous thing. She picked one of the delicate stems from the water and held it out for him to see. He leaned closer, examining the intricate, lace-like pattern of the flower-head. "Queen Anne's lace," she said, her eyes shining with affection for the humble weed. "Most florists ignore it. It's wild, it doesn't last very long in a vase, and the stems are all different heights and strengths. It's not uniform." She looked up from a flower and met his gaze directly, holding it. "But I think it's one of the most beautiful. It's honest." And that was the moment the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for him. He wasn't just looking at flowers anymore. He was seeing her. He was finally, truly understanding the journal, the crimson scarf, the scent of jasmine and honey. It was all connected. It was a philosophy of radical authenticity in a world that rewarded, above all else, polished artifice. And it was calling to something deep inside of him, a part of his soul he didn't even know existed. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently, reverently, touched the delicate petal of the Queen Anne's lace she was holding. It was a moment of profound, silent connection. "I'll take all of them," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Nia laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the small shop. She thought he was joking. "All of them? What in the world would you do with an entire bucket full of Queen Anne's lace?" His gaze didn't leave hers. The hint of a sad, self-aware smile touched his lips. "My apartment, it lacks honesty." That single sentence was more than an observation. It was a confession. It was an admission that his world of sterile, curated perfection was missing something vital, something essential. It was the moment he stopped seeing her as the owner of the wrong suitcase and started seeing her as a woman whose values fundamentally challenged the very foundation of his life. He was seeing her. And in his quiet, intense gaze, for the first time in a very long time, Nia felt truly seen. The invisible, impossibly long bridge between their two vastly different worlds was suddenly starting to feel not just real, but solid. And they were both, cautiously, with a mixture of terror and hope, beginning to take their first steps across it. The days that followed felt like a strange and beautiful dream. Cassian, a man whose every minute was usually scheduled, accounted for, and monetized, found himself creating space. He manufactured reasons to be in her neighborhood, arranging meetings in offices nearby that he had no real need to visit. He, a man who commanded a global communications network, would find himself in the middle of a multi-million-dollar negotiation and would have to resist the overwhelming urge to text her, just to ask what a zinnia symbolized. To Nia's utter and constant shock, this billionaire CEO, this man who could summon a private jet with a single phone call, insisted on joining her for the most mundane, most ordinary parts of her life. He accompanied her to the chaotic wholesale flower market at the crack of dawn, looking endearingly out of place in his tailored overcoat amongst the grizzled, shouting vendors. He helped her carry heavy, 50-pound bags of potting soil from her car to the shop, his expensive leather shoes getting scuffed and dusty. He didn't seem to know how to do any of it, but he was there. He was present. His focus, his entire formidable attention, was on her. He was proving, in 100 small, unspoken ways, that his interest was in her, the real her, not in some romanticized fantasy of the simple flower shop girl. One rainy Tuesday evening, he was in her apartment. Her world. He had insisted on coming to her, on seeing where and how she lived. He stood in the middle of her small living room, looking around at her mismatched furniture, her overflowing bookshelves, the general, comfortable chaos of her life, and he looked at home. He looked more at ease, more at peace, than he ever did in the cavernous, echoing silence of his own breathtaking penthouse. They had ordered takeout, and they were eating it straight from the cartons, sitting on the floor, using her coffee table as their dining table. The conversation flowed easily between them now, a comfortable, meandering river after the initial awkward rapids of their first few meetings. She found herself telling him about her ex-boyfriend, the one who had lovingly, condescendingly referred to her flower shop as her cute little hobby. The one who had tried to streamline her creative process with spreadsheets and efficiency models. "He wanted to fix me," she said, her voice soft, the old pain still a faint shadow in her eyes. "He thought my passion was inefficient, that my sentimentality was a character flaw. He didn't see me, not really. He just saw a project that he could improve, something he could optimize." Cassian listened, his jaw tight with a quiet anger. He recognized the sterile, corporate language of optimization. It was the language of his own world. But hearing it used against her, used to diminish the very things he was coming to admire, to cherish most about her, filled him with a cold, protective fury. He didn't say anything. He just reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it gently, a simple, grounding gesture. The conversation faded away into a comfortable silence. The only sounds were the gentle patter of the rain streaking down the windowpane, the soft hum of the city outside, and the quiet, steady thumping of their own hearts, which seemed to be beating in the same rhythm. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft, warm kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. And then, he slowly, deliberately, began to lean in. It wasn't a sudden, passionate lunge. It was a slow, careful movement, a question being asked without a single word. It gave her all the time in the world to pull away, to stop him. But she didn't. She leaned in, too. He kissed her. And the world seemed to stop spinning. The first kiss. It was the physical culmination of all the unspoken words, the shared glances, the quiet moments of emotional intimacy they had been building between them. It was tender and searching at first, a question and an answer all at once, then it deepened into something more, something that spoke of a longing neither of them had known they possessed. It was a kiss that tasted of cheap noodles and expensive wine, of jasmine and honey and the faint, clean scent of his world. It was the collision of their two galaxies, not in a fiery, chaotic explosion, but in a perfect, breathtaking, silent alignment. And it was happening here, in her world, in her modest, cluttered apartment. In that moment, he had finally, truly left his ivory tower for her. It wasn't a conquest, it was a surrender. The kiss was a silent, solemn promise that the bridge between their worlds wasn't just possible, it was already built, and they were standing in the very middle of it, together. And then, silence. For 2 full days after that perfect, world-altering kiss, he went completely silent. No texts. No calls. Nothing. The silence was a vacuum, and into that vacuum, all of Nia's old insecurities, the ones her ex had so carefully planted and cultivated in her heart, began to sprout like ugly, choking weeds. Maybe this was just how men like him operated. A momentary diversion, a charming dalliance with a simple, authentic girl from the flower shop before returning to his real life, a life of supermodels and socialites and women who understood his world. The thought was a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. Maybe she had just been a curiosity, The answer to the intriguing question of who owned the strange, sentimental suitcase. The beautiful, impossible dream of the last few weeks was dissolving, frame by frame, into a familiar, bitter, predictable reality. Her heart ached with a disappointment so sharp and sudden it felt like a betrayal. On the afternoon of the second day of silence, there was a loud knock on her apartment door. Nia jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a courier, a young man holding a ridiculously large, opulent bouquet of flowers. They were the most exotic, perfect, and breathtakingly expensive flowers she had ever seen. Jet-black orchids, rare, striped tulips, blossoms so perfect they looked like they were made of wax. It was, without a doubt, a billionaire's bouquet. And her heart sank even further. They were the kind of flowers she hated. Flawless, imported, genetically engineered for a perfection that felt sterile and lifeless. They were beautiful, but they had no soul. They were dishonest flowers. He didn't get it. After all of their conversations, after everything, he still didn't get her. But then she saw it. Tucked deep inside the ostentatious bouquet, almost completely hidden from view, was a single, slightly imperfect, wild-picked stem of Queen Anne's lace. And attached to it, with a simple piece of twine, was a small, heavy, cream-colored card. His handwriting was a strong, clean, decisive script. She opened it, her hands trembling. It said, "Nia, forgive my silence. I was in Zurich closing a deal that was set in motion long before I met you. I found myself distracted, unable to focus, thinking only of our conversation. Of you. I apologize for not communicating. It is a failing of mine, one I fully intend to correct. These flowers are a poor and foolish imitation of the beauty you create every day, but the men in my world only know how to communicate through grand, empty gestures. The single stem is the only thing in this bouquet that is real. It's to remind you that I was listening. I see you, Cassian." Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees felt weak. She had to sit down. It wasn't a brush-off. It was an apology. It was a confession of his own vulnerability, his own shortcomings. He wasn't perfect. He was trying. The grand, ridiculous bouquet was the language of his world, a language he was still fluent in. But the single, humble flower, that was the language of hers. He was learning to speak both. The crushing tension of his silence was released in a single emotional wave, replaced by a feeling so profound and grateful it brought hot tears to her eyes. Their relationship deepened, settling into a comfortable, happy rhythm. But bridging their two worlds was not without its tremors, its aftershocks. Cassian, a man whose core instinct was to identify and solve problems, saw Nia's financial struggles not as a part of her journey, not as a source of her strength, but as a flaw in the system that needed to be fixed. He was in her shop one afternoon, looking at her accounts on a sleek tablet while she excitedly showed him a new local supplier she'd found for organic roses. He had a frown on his face. "Your margins are too low," he said, the CEO in him taking over. "Your suppliers are overcharging you. Your rent for this location is inefficient given the foot traffic. I can fix this." He looked up at her, his eyes bright with the familiar fire of a problem solver. "I'll have my finance team restructure your entire business model. I can give you an interest-free loan to scale up, secure a better location in a prime commercial district." He said it with the best intentions. In his world, this was an act of love. This was an act of profound support. But to Nia, his words were like a ghost from her past, whispering the same old, toxic, soul-crushing refrain. "You're not good enough. You need to be fixed." The light in her eyes died. Her shoulders, which had been relaxed and happy moments before, tensed up. She took a small, unconscious step back from him, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional one that had just opened up between them. "No," she said, her voice quiet, but tight and sharp as a shard of glass. Cassian looked up from his tablet, genuinely confused by her reaction. "No. Nia, this is what I do. I build empires. I can make your business secure. I can give you everything you've ever wanted." And that's when the new tension, the most critical conflict they had yet faced, the one that would determine the entire future of their relationship, erupted in the quiet, sun-drenched flower shop. Nia turned to face him fully. Her expression was not angry, but one of deep, profound hurt. "I don't want you to fix my business, Cassian," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the effort of keeping it steady. "And I don't want you to fix me. This shop, with all of its flaws and its struggles and its inefficient rent, is mine. I built it. With my own 2 hands. My ex tried to do this. He tried to turn my passion into a portfolio. He tried to turn my dreams into a series of bullet points on a spreadsheet. I need to know," she took a shaky breath, "I need to know that you see me as a partner, not as a project. I need to know that you see me as an equal." The air in the small shop grew thick with unspoken history, with old wounds. For Nia, this was the ultimate test. It was one thing for this incredible man to find her world charming and quaint. It was another thing entirely for him to respect it, even its struggles, even its imperfections. The camera of this story now focuses on Cassian. And we can see a flicker of confusion, then a dawning of understanding, and then a look of genuine horror on his face as he realizes, truly realizes, what he has just done. He looked at the sterile, data-driven numbers on his tablet, and then he looked at her, at the hurt and defiance in her beautiful eyes, as if seeing his colossal mistake in stark black and white. And this, right here, is where he proved he was different. The Cassian Royce of a month ago, of a lifetime ago, would have argued. He would have used logic and reason, he would have proven his point with charts and projections, he would have shown her how her emotional approach was holding her back. But this Cassian was not that man. He had been irrevocably changed by the scent of jasmine and honey, by the sight of honest flowers, by the simple, grounding touch of her hand. He immediately put the tablet down on the counter, as if it were suddenly distasteful to him. He closed the distance between them, his movements slow, careful, as if approaching a frightened animal. He looked her directly in the eye, and his own gaze was filled with a raw and genuine regret. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet, raw with a sincerity she had never heard from him before. "I'm sorry. I am deeply, truly sorry. It's my instinct, to control, to optimize. It's a flaw, a relic from a world that has no place here, with you. Your shop is perfect because it's yours. Your strength is in building it your way. I see you as my equal." He paused, and his voice dropped even lower. "In fact, I see you as my superior in all the ways that truly matter." The release of tension was immediate and profound, like a storm breaking. He understood. He had listened, not just to the words she was saying, but to the history and the hurt behind them. He had respected her boundary without question. He had validated her strength. In that single breathtaking moment, he hadn't just apologized for a careless mistake. He had reached back in time and healed a part of her past wound. He had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that he was not her ex. He was a man who was not only willing to step into her world, but was willing to live by its rules, even if he didn't fully understand them yet. It was, perhaps, inevitable. The fortress walls of Cassian Royce's intensely private life, walls he had spent a decade reinforcing, were finally breached. Their quiet, carefully built, private world was suddenly, and brutally, exposed to the harsh, unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. A grainy photograph, taken by a paparazzo with a long lens, appeared on the cover of a glossy tabloid magazine. It showed them leaving her apartment building one morning. The headline, in huge garish letters, screamed, "Tycoon's New Petal, Billionaire Cassian Royce dating a humble Brooklyn florist." For Cassian, it was a familiar annoyance, a parasitic pest that came with the territory of his wealth and fame. But for Nia, it was a profound violation. Her simple, authentic life was being twisted into a sordid, cheap fairy tale. The articles, and the vicious online comments that followed, painted her as a gold digger, a naive simpleton, a pet project for the big, powerful CEO. Her shop, her beloved sanctuary, was no longer safe. Tourists and gossip seekers treated it like a zoo exhibit. They came not to buy flowers, but to stare and whisper at the florist who had somehow managed to bag a billionaire. The public scrutiny was a massive, terrifying new tension, forcing them to confront the reality of their different worlds in the ugliest way imaginable. That night, they were in his penthouse. The city lights twinkled below them like a carpet of fallen stars, but inside the apartment, the mood was somber and heavy. Nia was curled up on one of his enormous white couches, looking small and overwhelmed. Cassian was pacing back and forth, his movements sharp and angry, like a caged tiger. "I'll make it stop," he growled, his voice tight with a cold fury she had never seen from him before. "I'll sue them into oblivion. I will buy the entire publication and I will shut it down. I will destroy them. It was the language of his world. A world where problems were not solved, but crushed with the overwhelming force of power and money. But Nia knew, with a sinking heart, that this wasn't a problem that could be crushed. It was an idea. A narrative. A story. You can't, she whispered, her voice hoarse from unshed tears. It's out there now. This is your world, isn't it? This is the price of being with you. The full, terrifying weight of their differences crashed down on them in that moment. He could protect her with his money, with his lawyers, with his power. But he couldn't protect her from the judgment, from the whispers, from the insidious way his world would inevitably try to cheapen and diminish hers. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his anger draining away, replaced by a deep, aching pain. He came and sat beside her, gathering her into his arms. "We can disappear," he said, his voice suddenly desperate. "We can go to my private island in the Caribbean. No one will ever find us there. We can live there. Just us." And Nia knew, with absolute certainty, that he meant it. He would give up his empire for her. But she also knew, with that same certainty, that it wasn't the answer. She would be living in a gilded cage, and he would be a king in exile. It would be another way of him fixing the problem, of using his immense power to shield them from reality instead of facing it. And in the process, she would lose her shop. Her life. The very things he had first fallen in love with. This was the pivotal moment. The ultimate choice. The climax of her own story. She could retreat, let his world win, and hide away with him in paradise. Or she could stand her ground, plant her feet, and choose to walk through the fire with him. She pulled back from his embrace slightly, just enough to look him in the eye. Her expression was resolute. Tears shone in her eyes, but her voice, when she spoke, was strong. "No," she said, clear and steady. "I'm not running away. Your world doesn't get to scare me out of my own. And it doesn't get to scare me away from you." She took a deep, fortifying breath, the decision solidifying in her heart like steel. If they want to see the florist dating the CEO, then let's give them a show. But we do it on our terms. In our world. Cassian looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe, profound relief, and a love so deep and powerful it was breathtaking. Her decision to try anyway, to face the crucible of his world without flinching, was a massive, triumphant release of tension. This wasn't him saving her. This was her choosing him, choosing them, with her eyes wide open to the costs. It was the moment she proved, to him and to herself, that she was not just a partner in his life, but a queen in her own right, strong enough to stand beside him not as a consort, but as an equal. The very next night was the annual Royce Foundation Gala, the absolute pinnacle of the city's glittering social calendar. It was Cassian's home turf. The press was there in force, a veritable feeding frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions, all of them hungry for a comment, a glimpse of the mystery woman. Cassian's car pulled up to the red carpet. He stepped out, looking impossibly handsome and powerful in a classic tuxedo. He turned and opened the car door. He held out his hand. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a smaller, softer hand took his. And Nia stepped out of the car. She was a vision. But she wasn't wearing a couture gown that cost tens of thousands of dollars. She was wearing a simple, breathtakingly elegant dress in a deep, vibrant crimson, the exact color of her pashmina scarf. Her only jewelry was a simple, delicate necklace. And woven into her dark hair, a subtle, defiant statement, was a single, delicate sprig of Queen Anne's lace. She was bringing her world into his. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't assimilating. She wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. She walked beside him down the gauntlet of flashing cameras, her head held high, looking not at the clamoring press, but at him. And he, in turn, had eyes only for her. They didn't speak a single word to the reporters. They didn't have to. Their silent, united front was a message clearer than any headline. They were together. And they were unafraid. Several months passed. They had found their balance. Not in his world, and not in hers, but in a new third world, one they had painstakingly built together, a world that took the best of both. Cassian was still a CEO, still a titan of industry. But he had changed. He delegated more. He left the office at a reasonable hour. He had learned the names of all the flowers in Nia's shop, and their meanings. His vast, sterile penthouse, once a silent monument to loneliness, was now filled with life, with color, with mismatched vases of honest flowers, and with a constant, beautiful, lingering scent of jasmine and honey. Nia's shop, the honest petal, was thriving. After the initial ugly media storm, her quiet strength and unwavering authenticity had won people over. She had expanded, but on her own terms, opening a small community workshop space next door to teach others about local horticulture and floral design. She had never taken a single cent of his money. Her success was entirely, and proudly, her own. They had bought a beautiful, rustic estate in the countryside, a place with sprawling, untamed gardens. It wasn't a palace, it was a home. And on a warm autumn afternoon, as the leaves on the trees were turning to gold and fire, he told her they were hosting a small dinner party for some of his business associates. As the sun began to set, casting a long golden glow over everything, he led her out into the garden. And she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The garden was lit with hundreds of tiny, warm fairy lights, strung through the trees like captured stars. In the very center of the wildflower patch she had planted herself, a single, elegant table was set for two. In the distance, a string quartet was playing a soft, familiar melody. "Cassian," she whispered, turning to him, "where are all the guests?" He turned to face her, and his cool gray eyes were warm with an emotion so powerful it was a tangible force between them. "There are no guests," he said, his voice thick with a feeling he no longer tried to hide. "There is only you. There has only ever been you." He took both of her hands in his. He looked around them, at the wild, beautiful, imperfect garden she had created, at the vibrant life she had breathed into his once monochromatic world. "Before I met you," he began, his voice shaking just slightly, "I lived in a black and white world. A world of logic and silence. I thought that was strength. I thought that was control. I didn't know what I was missing because I didn't know that color and warmth and honesty even existed. I was living my life in a locked room, and I was so used to it, I didn't even know I was the prisoner." He reached into his jacket pocket. But he didn't pull out a velvet ring box. He pulled out the small, unassuming glass bottle from her suitcase, the one with the simple handwritten label, "Jasmine and Honey." "And then this," he said, holding it up in the twilight, the golden liquid glowing. "This was the key. Your scent. Your world. You crashed into my life in a whirlwind of color and chaos and honesty, and you unlocked everything. You taught me that true value isn't found on a balance sheet. It's found in the profound beauty of something real, something honest." And then, he got down on one knee. He opened his other hand, and nestled in his palm was not a massive, flawless diamond, but a simple, elegant gold ring, exquisitely designed to look like a twisting vine. And set in the center was not a diamond, but a single, small, perfect pearl, the color of a Queen Anne's lace petal. This was it. The final, ultimate payoff. The resolution to the central question of their entire improbable story. Can these two people, from two completely different worlds, really make it work? "Nia Reid," he said, his voice finally breaking with the weight of his emotion. "You are the only unforeseen variable I ever want in my life. You are my home. Will you build this world with me? Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Nia's face, but she was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated, uncomplicated joy. She nodded, unable to speak, and he slid the perfect, honest ring onto her finger. He stood and pulled her into a kiss that was a culmination of everything. The chance encounter, the stolen journal, the honest flowers, the battles fought and the victories won. It was a kiss that sealed their two worlds, their two souls, their two lives, into one. The story of the cold CEO and the warm-hearted florist was never about a billionaire saving the girl next door. It was the story of two incomplete souls from different universes who found their missing pieces in the most unlikely of places. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most valuable, most beautiful things in life aren't the ones that are perfect and polished, but the ones that are a little bit messy, a little bit wild, and completely, breathtakingly honest. And it all started with a simple mistake, a swapped suitcase, and the intoxicating, life-changing scent of her.